From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden acknowledges that about 10 classified documents were discovered last year at a private office he used after leaving the vice presidency, as listeners write in with comments and questions on student loans. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleague, the one and only columnist Kim Strassel. Welcome, Kim. CBS News had the scoop that days before the midterm elections in November, roughly 10 documents with classification markings were found amid President Biden's vice presidential files at an office he used from 2017 to about 2019. According to CNN report, those documents included intelligence memos and briefing materials that covered topics including Ukraine, Iran, and the United Kingdom. Some of those documents were reportedly in the category of sensitive compartmented information, which means that they were essentially above top secret. And here's how President Biden addressed the matter at a summit in Mexico City on Tuesday.
When my lawyers were clearing out my office at the University of Pennsylvania, they set up an office for me, secure office in the Capitol. The 4 years after being vice president, I was a professor at Penn. They found some documents in a box in a locked cabinet, or at least a closet. And as soon as they did, they realized there were several classified documents in that box. And they did what they should have done. They immediately called the archives, turned them over to the archives, and I was briefed about this discovery and surprised to learn that there were any government records that were taken there to that office. But I don't know what's in the documents. My lawyers have not suggested I ask what documents they were. I've turned over the boxes. They've turned over the boxes to the archives, and we're cooperating fully with the review, and which I hope will be finished soon, and there'll be more detail at that time.
According to news reporting this week, the Justice Department is now investigating how these documents ended up in a closet in Biden's office. But the context of this, of course, is the Justice Department's simultaneous investigation of President Trump for retaining classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, which led to the dramatic, extraordinary FBI raid of his home last year. And at that time, here's what President Biden said on 60 Minutes.
When you saw the photograph of the top secret documents laid out on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, what did you think to yourself, looking at that image?
How that could possibly happen, how anyone could be that irresponsible. And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods? By that I mean names of people who helped, or et cetera. And it's just totally irresponsible.
And you don't know what was in those documents?
I have not asked for the specifics of those documents because I don't want to get myself in the middle of whether or not the Justice Department should move or not move on certain actions they can take. I've agreed I would not tell them what to do and not, in fact, engage in telling them how to prosecute or not.
Kim, my first reaction here is just who is scripting our political drama these days? Not even George Santos could make up this plot twist.
Totally irresponsible, Kyle. And oh my gosh, I wonder what data and sources and methods could have been compromised by those documents that Biden was holding in that closet. That's just the amusing comparison here, is given the high dudgeon and given the actions of the Department of Justice with regards to these Trump documents, to now have this news that, oh my goodness, another president has a little problem with classified documents that ended up where they're not supposed to be. Now, the thing that strikes me as also amusing in this storyline is the rush for the press and the president's defenders to explain why these two scenarios are entirely different, and to kind of recast the whole question of the problem of classified documents outside of secure facilities. So now we're being told that, oh, it's not that unusual for a small number of documents to get mixed up as people are leaving the White House and things are changing. It's pretty common. By the way, this wasn't in his private residence. It was in a locked closet in an office office somewhere else. Lots of people noting that this is something that is normally just handled administratively, not a criminal issue here. By the way, he handed them over immediately, as Biden also pointed out that he apparently did it the right way and Trump did not. But the reality is, Kyle, is that these are two scenarios in which there were classified documents that were not where they were supposed to be with regard to presidencies. And there's just no way for the Biden administration to escape that. So it's hugely embarrassing. I would also note, we can talk about this a little bit, in some ways, the fact that Biden has these documents is more concerning because he, unlike the president, doesn't have certain powers over records from his time in office.
Well, I do think it's fair to acknowledge in Biden's case, these are 10 documents. He says he was surprised that they were in that closet and maybe they were packed up by an aide, or maybe that's not exactly the whole truth that we're getting right now. It wouldn't be the first time. But when the lawyers discovered them, the National Archives was notified that day. The documents were handed over the next day. In Trump's case, he had something like 300 classified documents, or I should say, documents with classification markings at Mar-a-Lago. There were some negotiations with the National Archives. Eventually, he turned over some of those. A subpoena was issued for the rest of them. At one point, President Trump's lawyer signed a statement saying that a diligent search had been done of Mar-a-Lago and everything remaining had been turned over. The FBI apparently had some information that that was not in fact the case, which is what precipitated the raid. And lo and behold, there were more classified documents at Mar-a-Lago that had not been turned over. And so, I mean, I think those differences are fair to acknowledge. But Kim, maybe go into some of those other questions about the role of a president versus a vice president. And I mean, it does seem to me that President Trump was acting as if he intended to keep those documents. On the other hand, there are some ambiguities in the Presidential Records Act and the rules surrounding when a president leaves office has to hand all this stuff over.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Presidential Records Act, and that's an important one. That act has provisions that do give the presidents access to their former documents, working in tandem with the National Archives. That is not a privilege that is extended to vice presidents. So that is one thing that does make the fact that Biden has these documents a little bit different. The other aspect of this is that a lot of the debate that's going on over Trump's documents come down to his argument that has been made through various people who work around him that he had a standing order when he was in the White House that as documents left the facility, they were automatically declassified. And this raised all kinds of questions about the president's declassification authorities. What nobody disputes is that the president is the ultimate declassifier. The fact that documents even get classified relate to the power that a president himself has to classify documents and therefore to declassify them. Now, this has led to a lot of debates about whether or not that needed to be formalized, that process. Is it really reasonable to think that if Trump just thought about declassifying them and they suddenly become declassified, does it count if there are still markings on them and they ended up at his place? All of these are very interesting legal questions. But I would just note that whatever the boundaries of Trump's power to do that, and it could end up in court, but whatever the boundaries, he at least in theory has that power, whereas the vice president does not. So it isn't as if that is an excuse that Biden could use in this scenario and say, oh, well, you know, I declassified these. It doesn't seem that he's trying to, but I guess overall the point is that he has even less of a claim to have been in possession of these than Trump did.
On the point about declassification, that's right. The president does have broad authority to declassify any material he wants. And we saw President Trump exercise some of that authority. At one point, if I'm remembering right, he tweeted a satellite image of something that was happening in Iran. And so he can do that. The president in office can do that if he wants. There has been some questions about whether any aides recall this order that he claims existed to declassify things as they were leaving the facility. And as far as I'm aware, everybody who's gotten that question so far has said no. On the point about the Presidential Records Act, I think access is the key word there. And I'll just read a few lines. So it says the presidential records of a former president shall be available to such former president or the former president's designated representatives. And so obviously that suggests the president can get what he needs if he's writing his memoirs or something like that. On the other hand, other provisions of this law say that after a president's term of office, the archivist of the United States shall assume responsibility for the custody, control, and preservation and access to the presidential records. The archivist shall deposit all presidential records into presidential archival depository or another archival facility operated by the United States. And so it seems to me on this question of who was supposed to be in possession of the documents, it looks to me from reading this law that the archives is right, that President Trump was able to have access to that, but that stuff was supposed to be in possession of the United States government, their government records. But Kim, the question when you're going into the idea of a prosecution for something like this, it no longer becomes who has the best reading of the law. It's can you convince a jury of 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a crime committed here. And it seems like there are complicated issues here that Trump would raise in his defense. And that's not even to go into the political argument that Hillary Clinton exposed classified information on her private server. Apparently Biden had classified information in his private office closet. And is the Justice Department really going to prosecute Trump now for a crime that looks pretty similar on its face?
Yeah, I mean, Special Counsel Jack Smith is looking into this now, and I suppose he could attempt to take all those arguments you just made into a court of law and go through them. The problem is that this is unprecedented. He might believe that he has the deck stacked in his favor, given that this would likely be brought in D.C. with a D.C. jury, none of whom have any real love for Donald Trump. But again, it is unprecedented. The legal arguments have never been made. And do you really want to go down that road, given as well the politics? Because with the announcement of this discovery of Biden's documents, is that it really scrambled the political calculation for Jack Smith. He's got a real headache right now because can you really sell the public, make the argument to the public that it is right in this case to go and prosecute a former president in an unprecedented move over a document dispute that has a lot of ins and outs and complications from a legal question, but that you're going to give a pass, as you said, to Hillary Clinton, who was absolved by the FBI for her own blatant mishandling of her server, or that you're going to give a pass to the current president over his own what seems to be mishandling of classified documents. And add into that as well, too, are you really going to take that step and go after the guy who is potentially the chief political competitor to your current boss in office? I mean, the optics would simply stink. And, in my mind, it's another reason I don't think this raid should have ever happened, that this should have been handled administratively. It just doesn't look good when justice departments are raiding former presidents' houses over document disputes. Save that for the really big stuff. But I think it's an additional reason for the Department of Justice to step back here.